Hi, everybody. This is Michael Green, Director of Research at Audience Science, for today's webinar on best practices in software sourcing and management. Today, we have a very special guest with us, Duncan Jones. He's a Vice President and Principal Analyst at Forrester Research. Duncan is a leading expert on software pricing and licensing and helps clients understand and address the effects of technology changes on software contracts. I can't understate the importance of this for marketers today. As we deal with marketers, many times they are engaging in software negotiation for one of their first times. And I think Duncan's expertise from other parts of the enterprise can be incredibly useful in terms of informing how marketers should address their technology purchasing decisions. So with that, with no further ado, I'll hand things over to Duncan. Please take it away, Duncan.
Yeah, thanks very much, and thanks for inviting me to talk on this topic, which I absolutely agree with you is very important. Increasingly, we see people in various parts of our clients' businesses buying technology in various ways, and there are a lot of mistakes for the unwary, and I'm hopefully going to point some of those out and give everyone some best practices in how to do things effectively. As the title of this slide says, really the essence is commercial deals to drive business outcomes, and that's really what we're all striving for. Yes, we want to save money, reduce risk, but the key point of all of this is generally we're buying technology to drive business outcomes. Now, I study the world of software and the impact of technology changes on contracts, on pricing and licensing, and I've noticed that over the last few years, a lot of the fundamental assumptions have changed. Some of the concepts that we've relied on for many years to price our software are no longer really applicable in today's technology environment. It used to be that hardware was expensive, and there was an assumption that if you threw a lot of hardware at something, it must be very valuable to you, and therefore probably the software should be priced in proportion to the amount of hardware that you were throwing at it. But in today's world, that's no longer the case. There was also an assumption that value was related to human beings using software. Therefore, if you just counted the human beings, that told you the value as well, and that's no longer valid either. Instead, this is the world that we all live in. We've got these cloud data centers. We're accessing software. We don't know or care how many processes are being used to drive our software. We're sharing data increasingly with other systems. All the systems are interconnected. That creates problems for software licensing, because there are often strict rules about the extent to which you can share data from one system to another. And as users, we now access the software and the information in it from multiple devices. So some of the old certainties of counting devices just is no longer a good way of tracking our usage of the technology. Now, there is a lot of new commercial models that have sprung up to address this new technology environment. No longer is it necessary to buy a perpetual license and assign it to a particular bit of hardware and run it that way. And this slide, I won't go into all that much detail, but suffice it to say there's no perfect answer. Each commercial model has its advantages and disadvantages and its place in certain cases. In the software world, we're very familiar with this perpetual license model, very profitable for the software companies, drives investment. In the long term, it's probably cheaper than software as a service, which is an annual model. You keep on paying for the software every year, long after the point at which it becomes more expensive than the perpetual license. But the thing is, it's more flexible. We can usually scale our investment up and down as we grow or as we start using the software more. But there is this danger of getting locked in. There's an assumption that we sign up a contract for 2 years or 3 years, and at the end of that period, we're just going to renegotiate the terms, and we're going to have just the same leverage as we had when we started out. But that's rarely the case. if we're using a software product and we like it, we're going to be reluctant to switch. We've probably invested in implementing it. And it could be that even if we wanted to move, we can't because there's data in the system and we may have no right to get our data back even. Another model that's out there is what some people are calling pay-as-you-go, PAYG. It's the concept of software as a utility, charging retrospectively for metered actual use. And it depends on the software product as to how easy that is to do. It could be that you count transactions, or it could be that you count actual hits on a website, or the actual revenue that you gain through a tool. The difficulty I have with these pay-as-you-go models is that the costs are therefore a little bit unpredictable. It could be that suddenly there's a usage spike and we get a bill at the end of the month for a lot more than we expected. And it could be quite complex to track. But if we've got very variable, volatile usage, it can be a good way of buying the software. A good example is maybe where developers are developing some software and they suddenly need to have some infrastructure, very, very short period of time to test their software that they've developed. They can buy that under pay-as-you-go. They don't have to buy a full license and keep it forever. The last one, this is quite interesting actually, where the software is now increasingly bundled within a service. So we're paying transaction fees and they include a software element. It isn't explicitly stated, but it's just there in the value that we receive. That can be a really nice and simple way of buying the software because we're buying this whole service and we just look at it as a total service. We don't care what's software and what isn't. So examples of this could be where we're processing payments online and we just pay a charge per transaction, or sending invoices to our suppliers and customers. We just pay per invoice. Now, the disadvantage with that model, though, is that we're sometimes mixing up the service with the software. So maybe we like the software, but we want to switch service providers. If it's all bundled together, we can't actually do that. We have to switch them both together. So bundling can be nice and simple, but it can also be dangerous and increase the lock-in. Now, this is just a conceptual slide on pay-as-you-go. It's really to make the point that it can be more expensive than people expect. I think there's an assumption that, well, if I'm only paying for what I actually use, then it must be cheaper than if I pay for a service even when I'm not using it. But of course, what that forgets is that the price point is different. So if whatever you buy, if you sign a contract for a certain volume, you're going to pay a lot lower price than if you just pay by the drink. And therefore, pay-as-you-go isn't necessarily cheaper. It depends on the volatility and unpredictability of your demand. So how do we choose which model is going to work for us then when we're buying a particular type of software or a service that includes a software element? The key to me is to look at which model is going to encourage a focus on our success from the point of view of the vendor. Now, if we can start off small with a low initial investment and then ramp up the expenditure as we get comfortable with the tool, as we roll it out to more people, as we use it in more parts of our business, that's going to encourage the software provider to help us be successful, because the sooner we're successful, the sooner we're going to increase the investment. We want to have the right to reduce the costs as well, so the flexibility to ramp up as we grow, but also to ramp down if our business shrinks or if we decide to switch to other products, either wholly or partially. And that's important because if we have that right, that threat to scale back the costs, that focuses the mind of the service provider in ensuring that we're happy with their product, that the problems are being addressed quickly, that we're actually using and getting business value from it. So what we notice from the new breed of vendors who are providing these sort of flexible commercial models like software as a service and pay-as-you-go is that they have a totally different sales and service mindset from the old style vendors who sell perpetual licenses that you install on a PC or a server and then forget about. Because unlike the perpetual people who've had their money and they've taken it to the bank, the software as a service sellers need you to keep coming back every year and renewing your contract. But the downside of that is this danger of lock-in. If you own the license, you can just carry on using it forever. But if you're getting it as a service from a provider, you can't carry on using it without paying. And there are some examples just recently of companies coming to the end of their initial software as a service contract and being faced with very high price rises, sort of 40, 50, 70% price rises, because the sweetheart deal that they got when they were an early adopter is no longer around. Now they're an established user. What they should have done, of course, was included some sort of price clause in the contract that they could renew at a particular value, or that the cost couldn't increase by more than a certain percentage each year. But they hoped that they would have an honest negotiation at the time, and now they're stuck. So one bit of advice I give here is really be very careful about bundling software with other services where you might actually want to change the service provider without throwing out the software. We want to have the flexibility because that gives us negotiation leverage when it comes to renewal time. But even so, we need to have the exit plan in the contract. If for whatever reason we want to pull out of that contract and not renew it, we need to have things like the right to get our data back without any additional charges. We've seen some companies that actually found they had to pay through the nose to get their own data back from the software as a service provider. And maybe an option to renew at a fixed price would just give us that comfort that we're not going to get taken advantage of when we're locked in. What about software pricing metrics then? Talked a little bit about how the old concept of pricing software based on hardware processing power is obsolete. Well, there's no real perfect alternative. Again, I won't go into too much detail on this slide. The key point of this slide is that there's no perfect answer. There's no good metric or bad metric. It's just what fits the software product that we're dealing with at the time. We need to be aware of the pros and cons and manage the downsides. So if we look at something like a metric like workload, that can be very fair, and it measures our actual usage, but it can be quite hard to predict. Maybe our revenue is more predictable, but then we have to recognize that our revenue might go up, and we're going to have to pay the software company more money because our revenue has gone up, and we may not want to do that. So how do we pick the metric that works for us? Well, when I am advising software companies, I say you need to have these 5 qualities in your pricing. And I'd encourage you, when you're looking at a pricing proposal, to look at the way the vendor has priced their product and say, does this make sense from these 5 qualities? Is it kind of value-based? Does my payment for the software increase when I'm using it more and getting more value from it? Or is it measured by some arbitrary metric that has nothing to do with whether I'm benefiting from the product or not? Is it simple? Can I understand it? Is it fair? Are there some rules in there that really penalize me for things that are outside my control? Is it future-proof? Can I predict how my costs are going to change in the future? Can I, if I really need to, control my costs and prevent them rising? And is it published? Is it available on a public website somewhere, or is it kept secret? Because if it's kept secret, then it's probably because the provider is trying to hide something. Now, a lot of software these days is priced by user, and that's probably a good metric, a good measure of value where we've got software that's actually being used by people. But we do have to be a little bit careful because generally there's a usage profile across our organization. So I'd encourage you to think all the time about your usage profile for a given application and not accept a one-price-fits-all proposal. Generally, we have people, and I've given some examples here, I call them content creators, whether they're people writing marketing collateral that we publish on our website or internal documents that are read by multiple readers. So they're content creators, there are reviewers, there are readers, maybe even end consumers that are seeing stuff on our website. They're technically using the product that created the content, but not in the same way as the people who were actually the authors of the document. And there are different approaches for dealing with this. Some vendors say, well, okay, we'll do what's called freemium. We'll charge for the content creators, but we'll give the license away for the consumers. Or maybe the other way around, we'll charge for all the consumers, but we won't actually charge anything for the people who are creating the content. Even if there isn't any formal recognition of the user profile, a lot of technology providers will do that informally through negotiation. So I talked about the need for pricing to be value-based. And the reason for that is if the pricing is value-based, that is, the price you pay grows as you're getting more value from the software, then that encourages the software provider to ensure that you're successful. So if you grow or expand your usage into new areas, you should be willing and happy to pay them more money. That's how they charge for their IP and deliver that value to you and develop it for the future. But we want to be looking at measuring drivers, not outcomes. I'm going to give an example of that in a minute. Measuring outcomes is very difficult. We can't say actually exactly how much value we got from using software. We want to have something that approximates to that. Usually we're looking at size and complexity. If we're looking at actual usage metrics, then as I talked about the usage profile, that's to do with the depth and frequency of usage, not just the breadth of people using the product. I also recommend avoid any metrics that focus on effort rather than value. So the amount of processing power I have to throw at the application or the number of people that are required, that's not business value, that's effort. I love this picture, and this is the buyer on the left looking up at the technology sales rep and saying, I'm not going to pay that, that's not fair. Fair is very subjective, but don't be afraid to use that word. You know, often the vendor's done the best job they can in deciding how to price their product, but it doesn't fit every use case. I don't recommend that you should try to convince them that they've done a bad job and that they should change the way they price their product. What I recommend is that you say, well, that's fine for everybody else, but it just isn't fair to me. So give me a special case, make me an exception. Could be that my usage profile is totally different to normal, or the way I'm using the product means I'm getting less value out of it than the other customers. And help the rep make the business case, so when he goes back to his head office to explain why he wants to give you an extra discount, he can explain the business reasons but also why it's important for him to get that deal, because you're going to walk away if he doesn't make your price fairer. I just thought I'd use a couple of examples to try to kind of illustrate the thought processes of applying these principles to a product. So let's imagine we've got a call center product. We're buying such software for our call center, or maybe selling it to companies that want to use it to run their call centers, and it's going to get calls coming in through the phone. We're all familiar with that press button A sort of process, route them to an available customer service rep, maybe give the CSR some information about us and our problem and any prior calls, and then manage the process of escalation and so on. Now, we don't want to price that by user, because that's the effort. That's the effort that we're having to throw at the problem. The driver for for the value is the number of calls that we get, not the number of people that we need to employ to deal with those calls. Because the worse the software is, the more CSRs we're going to need. Now, customers could be a good indicator, but that's not going to be fair, because there might be some companies with a huge number of customers who hardly get any complaints or customer service calls, and there are others who actually have relatively few customers, but they're still generating a lot of demand from the call center. Customer satisfaction might be a good way of measuring it. I mean, that's the outcome that we're driving at, but that's very difficult to measure. And anyway, what happens is we capture that value, we improve the customer satisfaction. Do we then reduce the price in subsequent years? It can be a difficult conversation. So I would say probably something like calls coming in, that's the activity, or maybe defining it a little differently. The number of incidents that we handle, they may not all be calls. They may be even emails or even self-service incidents that the software resolves without actually needing a human being to get involved. That would be relatively simple. It would be fair. It would be value-based, but not really relying on either effort or outcomes. Another example would be if we had some software that was analyzing our sales history, looking for some trends, looking for some exceptions that needed management attention. Again, user would be the wrong metric, because that's measuring the effort, not the value. Of course, we don't want to mess around with anything like processes. This is probably something, software as a service, we don't know or care what hardware it's running on. Things like sales volume or data volume, they're measures of size but not complexity, so they aren't quite right. Probably, and this is a good example because it's typical of many of the software products out there today, the value is quite hard to capture. So we might need to have more than one metric that reflects different aspects of how this is used. Something that captures the volume, but also maybe the number of dimensions, the number of products, or the number of customers that we're dealing with, the number of regions we're analyzing across. There's some measure of the complexity of the analysis that is driving the value at the end of the day. I hope those examples give you some analogies to use when you're thinking about a software contract or a service contract that includes a software element. When it lands on your desk, think of those things and say, well, is this a value-based metric, or is this, in fact, measuring effort? So these key recommendations, firstly, and overriding everything, we want to ensure that there are shared goals between us and the service provider to drive our success, whatever goal that is. We want to be thinking long-term. very often we're picking software with the intention of using that software for a very long time. We might be signing a 2 or 3 year contract, but we're hoping to use the same product for longer than that. So think long term and plan for the renewal at the outset. Think about the exit strategy, the renewal price option, the right to get your data back, that sort of thing. Always look at the pricing metrics that the vendors use. There's no rule that says those are the metrics that they must use. They've come up with those metrics because they think they're the best balance between being value-based and simple and fair. But make your own judgment on those qualities and be prepared to push back if you think that you're being unfairly treated. Don't try and get them to change their model. Try and get them to make you an exception. Recognize that the providers with the best pricing are often the ones who most understand what needs to be done to drive your success. They're probably the ones with the deepest insight and the deepest commitment to delivering that success. And lastly, if you think that you deserve special treatment, then make the business case. Explain why the normal metrics don't apply to you, why you're an unusual customer for that particular provider, but also have the walkaway position so that they know you won't sign the deal if you think it's unfair. Well, thanks for listening to our webinar. I hope this advice is useful, and for more information, we would always be happy to speak to new clients.
Great, Duncan. Thanks so much. So while we have you on the line, I think a few great questions that I have that came out of that conversation. Let's start with something that I know is a hot topic for marketers right now, that so many marketers are dealing and frustrated with at this point, and it's the question of data rights. I think it came up multiple times in your conversations and connected to this idea of what's the exit plan. How should marketers think about ensuring that they have flexibility with the usage of their data, especially if they want to leave a vendor? Is this just about negotiating the appropriate legal terms? Are there deeper things that they should be looking at in terms of how the technology operates? How do I really make sure that I have that level of flexibility when I'm going to an agreement with a software vendor?
Okay, so that's an interesting question. I would say yes, that it is both a legal issue and a technical issue. You want to be ensuring in the contract that you have the necessary rights to any of the data, but you also need to investigate technically how are you going to exercise those rights. Are there download tools already available? Do those have to be developed? Those are perfectly valid questions to ask. If the provider is pushing back on granting you the rights and saying, nope, that's not our policy, we never do that, well, you can push a little bit harder and see if they're really as fixed and stubborn as they're making out. Quite often they're not. But I also say, think of everything in terms of the discount that you're giving up by pushing for that concession. So what's it worth to you? What's it worth to them? If it really is their policy that they won't give you the data rights, but you really like their product, then are you willing to trade those data rights for 5% of the fee, 10% of the fee? I think that helps you, visualize it in money terms, and then you can go back and say, oh, okay, well, if you really can't change, then we'll accept it, but we need a 5% discount as compensation. And then,
right, so that data has some amount of value to it, right? And you should be able to put a price on that.
Exactly, and then we're just arguing about the price, right? The rep says, well, no, actually, if that's how much it's worth to you, maybe I can give you those data rights after all.
Makes sense. So again, on this topic of flexibility, you mentioned two different models that certainly face the risk of lock-in, both the classic kind of SaaS model, but also you mentioned these bundled models, which I think a lot of marketers are familiar with, having technology bundled into a broader service agreement. Can you go into a little more detail about, what does that risk of lock-in look like? Is it different in nature between a SaaS versus a bundled provider? And how, as a marketer, should I really think about these two types of options and the risk they have for lock-in?
So, yeah, the lock-in is really with the software side, that often there are additional services related to the software where there's more flexibility or more need for flexibility than with the basic software. And that there's maybe a user interface element or an analysis element that's part of the software that you really like, and you get used to it, you understand how it works, you don't want to change. But there might be some of the services around it where the service is less visible directly except via the UI. So it's easier to switch from a business point of view if you can do it contractually. And so by having a bundle deal, there's a danger that the lock-in that you get by having a SaaS product extends to the additional services which you really wanted to be separate. You can't actually change service provider without changing the UI and the analysis as well. So, for example, maybe the service provider isn't really doing a good job in meeting its service levels, or maybe it hasn't helped you be as successful as you wanted to be, and you want to change it, but you can't, because that would involve changing your user interface and retraining all your people and rebuilding a lot of integrations, and so you carry on with that deficient service provider.
Totally makes sense. And I think as a follow-up to that, one of the things that you mentioned as a benefit of these bundled providers is obviously the simplicity, right? You pay one body and you get both the service and the technology. But it seems to me that one of the downsides to this would also be kind of lack of transparency into what you're actually paying for, service versus technology. In other parts of the organization, how big of a concern is that? When do people decide that they need to split these services and technologies into separate areas of cost versus when they opt for simplicity to bring them together?
It's often, there would be two drivers. I think one is because it's getting too expensive, and the other is because they're not getting the desired outcomes. So either one of those would cause them to reevaluate the service, and at that point they find that they're kind of locked in. So if either the service provider is hiking their prices up, or actually the content that they're providing or the services that they're providing isn't doing a good enough job, and therefore you want to switch, switch to another provider, and you can't. Those are really the two key drivers, I think.
Yeah, totally makes sense. So I think my final. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to say you can kind of address that in the contract by upfront by firstly getting them to unbundle the price, or to tell you how much you're paying for each bit, but actually put the exit strategy in the contract to make it clear that you can carry on using the software, but switch to other service providers. And if they won't let you do that, then you've really got to step back and think: am I making a mistake here? Is this really too big a risk? Because I'm tying my success too closely to this one provider.
And again, I think there's that notion of it's both contractual, but also operationally you have to understand how it would actually work if you wanted to go about making that change, right?
Correct.
Yeah. I think it makes sense. So, Duncan, I think my final question is, when you think about the metrics that you would use to evaluate a relationship. What advice would you have in terms of how would a buyer create the right incentives for that vendor to be aligned with their business success? How do I create the right incentives for my software vendors?
So it's either already built into the model, or you negotiate as a separate one-off bonus. Something to do with the service contract, some sort of success bonus, as well as a penalty for lack of success. Risk and reward. I think often the buyer makes the mistake of demanding the risk penalty, but is unwilling to accept the reward bonus as well, and that's a mistake because the reward bonus does motivate the supplier to go that extra mile and ensure you are successful. And I think it's all about fairness to have both risk and reward. As I say, either built into the model, because if you're successful, you're going to expand its usage, you're going to sell more, you're going to analyze more sales data, you're going to do more advertising. Then it's built in. If it's not built in, then add it on as a separate risk and reward bonus.
Makes sense. Well, great, Duncan. I think that's great advice. Thank you so much for your time today, and everybody, thank you for joining our webinar.